The clock read 8:37 a.m. as Lucas Bennett pulled into the parking lot outside the Atlanta Municipal Courthouse. The crisp morning air carried the distant hum of rush-hour traffic, and the rising sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Lucas exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel tighter than he realized. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his days revolved around discipline, precision, and preparedness, qualities that had carried him through over a decade of high-stakes litigation. But today, life had conspired against him. It was supposed to be a simple morning, a minor inconvenience at best. He had come to dispute an erroneous property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother had left him. The city had inexplicably increased the taxes, despite Lucas spending weeks compiling proof that it was a mistake. But for him, the house was more than just property. It was where he had learned the meaning of right and wrong, under the watchful eye of the woman who had raised him. He should have had plenty of time to arrive early, but an urgent phone call from his team at the U.S. Attorney's Office had changed that. A defense motion had been filed in a high-profile human trafficking case, and Lucas had been forced to review it immediately. He had worked fast but thoroughly, giving his team the necessary guidance before finally rushing out the door. Now, as he stepped out of his car, a notification buzzed on his phone. A message from his assistant flashed across the screen. Judge Monroe has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Lucas sighed, slipping the phone into his briefcase. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon, and he had come armed with evidence. But something about that message lingered, an unease that settled deep in his gut. He shook it off and adjusted his navy moon suit, making his way toward the courthouse steps. 10 minutes to spare, barely enough time. And yet, he had no idea this morning would be anything but ordinary. Lucas stepped into the courthouse, the cool air inside contrasting sharply with the warmth outside. The municipal court was a far cry from the federal courtrooms where he spent most of his days. The walls were dull beige, the benches worn from decades of use, and the air carried the faint scent of coffee and old case files. The room buzzed with quiet tension, filled with people clutching documents, their faces lined with worry over parking tickets, small claims, and minor infraction. Lucas checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. He had 10 minutes to spare. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't late either. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, dodging people engaged in hushed conversations. Courtroom 306. A brass plaque etched with the name Judge Gerald Monroe gleamed under the fluorescent light. Lucas adjusted his tie, squared his shoulders, and stepped inside. The room was already half full, with people scattered across the wooden benches. Lucas took a seat toward the back, flipping open his folder to review his documentation. His focus was sharp, but only for a moment. The air in the courtroom changed as the judge entered. Gerald Monroe was an imposing man, with a head of neatly combed silver hair and piercing blue eyes that swept across the room like a searchlight. His mere presence commanded attention. He settled into his chair, and a stark silence fell over the room. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room shuffled to its feet. Lucas followed suit, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Judge Monroe wasted no time. He called case after case, working with mechanical efficiency, his tone crisp and detached. Lucas watched closely. A middle-aged man in a suit slipped in a few minutes late. No reaction from the judge. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes entered and quietly took a seat. Again, no reprimand. Lucas made a mental note. Then, at 9:15 a.m., his name was called. He rose smoothly, folder in hand, and made his way to the podium with calm, deliberate steps. The moment he stood before the bench, Judge Monroe's expression hardened. "You're late, Mr. Bennett," the judge said, his voice like a blade cutting through the quiet room. "Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own?" Lucas raised his hands slightly, palms out, a measured gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was handling urgent federal matters before coming here." The judge didn't even blink. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," Monroe snapped. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, I suggest you reevaluate your priorities." Lucas felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He kept his expression neutral, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Judge Monroe waved a dismissive hand. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt." Lucas's breath stilled for a fraction of a second. "Contempt? Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings," the judge declared. "You are hereby fined $800. The words landed like a hammer striking an anvil. Lucas's jaw tightened slightly, but he refused to let his expression change. Around him, a ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Lucas chose his next words carefully. "Your Honor, may I explain?" The judge's gavel slammed down. "You may not. Consider this a lesson in respecting the court." Lucas took a step back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about tardiness. This was about something deeper. He glanced briefly at the other latecomers, the man in the suit, the young woman near the front. Neither had been reprimanded. The disparity was glaring. Lucas wasn't about to let it slide. As he returned to his seat, he opened his folder, but this time he wasn't looking at his tax documents. Instead, he pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began writing notes. His pen moved swiftly, documenting everything he had just witnessed. The judge continued with the next case, his voice unwavering, but Lucas knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary morning. Lucas sat in the back row, his pen moving swiftly across the page. His mind was no longer on property taxes or the fine levied against him. It was on something much bigger. The courtroom moved on, cases proceeding in the same detached rhythm as before, but Lucas wasn't listening. Instead, he replayed what had just happened. Judge Monroe's $800 fine for contempt wasn't just unnecessary, it was punitive. It wasn't about court decorum. It wasn't about respecting the process. It was about control. Lucas had seen this kind of power play before, a judge exercising unchecked authority, using the bench as a throne, ensuring that certain people never forgot who held the gavel. And yet, it wasn't just the fine itself that gnawed at him. It was what he had observed before his name was called. The middle-aged man in a suit, the young woman scrolling on her phone. Both had entered after the session started, yet neither had received so much as a glance from the judge. Lucas scanned the room again. The young woman still sat near the front, completely unbothered, unaware of the double standard at play. The man in the blazer was now standing at the podium making his case. No mention of tardiness, no courtroom reprimand, no financial penalty. It was only him. Lucas let his gaze drift around the courtroom, taking in the subtle details he might have otherwise ignored. The faces of the other defendants, the clerk at her desk, the bailiff standing off to the side. There was something unspoken in their expressions. A mix of discomfort, quiet understanding, and something else. Something heavier. A man 2 rows ahead turned slightly, just for a moment, offering Lucas a brief, knowing glance. Lucas had spent his entire career in law. He knew how to read a courtroom. And in that moment, he understood exactly what he was seeing. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't about one fine. This was a pattern. Judge Monroe had a way of doing things, a certain method, and Lucas had just experienced it firsthand. A steep fine for a minor infraction, applied with discretionary authority, and levied in a way that sent a clear message. Lucas exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on his pen. He had seen corruption before. He had prosecuted fraud, bribery, organized crime, even human traffickers. But this was different. This was systemic. It was the kind of injustice that didn't make headlines, the kind that happened quietly, inside courtrooms that weren't monitored by national media. It was the kind of imbalance that eroded public trust in the system, one small injustice at a time, until one day, people stopped believing in justice altogether. Lucas set down his pen. He had a choice to make. He could pay the fine, handle his property tax dispute, and walk away. Or he could start asking questions. The tension in his chest settled into something sharper, something clearer. He already knew the answer. This wasn't over. Lucas didn't believe in rash decisions. Every move he made was calculated, precise. But at that moment, as he sat in the back row of the courtroom, he knew he had to act. Judge Monroe had already moved on to the next case, his voice steady, his authority unquestioned. The gavel was his weapon, and he wielded it with absolute certainty. But Lucas wasn't just another defendant. He was a federal prosecutor, and he had spent his career holding people like Monroe accountable. So when his name was called again, he rose from his seat, his steps measured and calm, and made his way back to the podium. Judge Monroe barely looked up. "Mr. Bennett, let's address your tax dispute." His tone was disinterested, as if the earlier fine had already dismissed Lucas from his mind. But Lucas wasn't about to let that happen. "Before we begin, Your Honor, I need to ask a question." That got the judge's attention. He narrowed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. "A question?" Monroe repeated, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "Go ahead." Lucas turned his gaze briefly toward the room before focusing back on the judge. "Are court rules applied equally to everyone here?" A wave of silence rolled through the courtroom. Judge Monroe stiffened slightly. The question had been asked plainly, but the implication was unmistakable. "This court follows the law, Mr. Bennett, and I apply it as I see fit." His voice was measured but tense. "If you're questioning my authority, I'm questioning the consistency of enforcement, Your Honor." Lucas's voice was even, steady. "Two other individuals entered this courtroom after me this morning. Neither received a fine." Judge Monroe's jaw clenched. Lucas didn't stop. If tardiness is such a grave offense, why were they allowed to proceed without penalty? Why am I the only one who was fined? He heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery. The clerk's fingers froze over her keyboard. Judge Monroe's grip on the armrests of his chair tightened slightly. "Are you accusing this court of bias, Mr. Bennett?" Lucas met the judge's piercing gaze without flinching. "I'm asking for clarity." A heavy pause settled over the room. The judge's face darkened. "You may not grandstand in my courtroom. Your fine stands. Now, let's move on to your case." Lucas exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. He had expected as much. But he had also forced Monroe to acknowledge it, if only for a moment. Lucas turned the page in his folder, shifting gears. "As for my case, Your Honor, I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment." Judge Monroe waved a dismissive hand. "I'll review it in due time." His tone had turned cold, almost indifferent. Lucas pressed on. "This document shows the original tax assessment, which remained consistent for 5 years. The new adjustment, however, reflects a 30% increase without proper notification or explanation." Enough. The gavel struck down hard, a crack echoing across the silent courtroom. "Your tardiness this morning is a matter we cannot overlook, Mr. Bennett. Do you truly believe that your federal responsibilities excuse breaking this court's rules?" Lucas studied the judge's expression carefully. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. Lucas chose his words carefully. "My delay was due to a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we all agree requires immediate attention." A flicker of something, annoyance, unease, crossed Monroe's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Your priorities, however noble, do not exempt you from following this court's procedures. Court rules exist for a reason." Lucas could feel the tension in the room, the eyes watching him, waiting. He took a slow breath. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Then why don't those rules apply to everyone?" The courtroom went completely still. Judge Monroe's face darkened, the slightest hint of red creeping up his neck. His gavel slammed down again, harder this time. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands." Lucas inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned and walked back to his seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's eyes on him. He sensed the quiet admiration of some, the unease of others. This wasn't the first time Judge Monroe had done this. But today, someone had challenged it openly. Lucas slipped his notebook out of his folder, his fingers moving swiftly as he began taking notes. This wasn't just about his case anymore. This was about something much bigger. And he wasn't done yet. Lucas had spent years building cases against criminals, piecing together evidence, timelines, and testimonies until the truth was undeniable. This situation was no different. By the time he stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of what had happened was still pressing on him. The fine itself, insignificant. The bigger issue, unacceptable. Judge Monroe's blatant double standard was more than just a moment of judicial discretion. It was a pattern, and Lucas knew that patterns could be proven. He got into his car, but didn't start the engine. Instead, he pulled out his notebook, flipping through his meticulous notes from the courtroom. Defendant 1, middle-aged white male in a suit, arrived late, no reprimand. Defendant 2, young white female, arrived late, no reprimand. Defendant 3, Lucas Bennett, arrived with 10 minutes to spare, fined $800. Lucas stared at the list, his jaw tightening. This was no accident. Pulling out his phone, he sent a brief but pointed text to his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Look into Judge Gerald Monroe's record, specifically fine amounts and enforcement inconsistent." His assistant, Ethan Marshall, responded almost immediately. "Already ahead of you. Give me a couple of hours." Lucas leaned back in his seat, his mind already turning over the next steps. The courtroom had been tense when he challenged Monroe. Not surprised, but tense. People had seen this before, even if they never spoke up. That meant there were more stories out there. Lucas knew exactly where to start. 2 hours later, Lucas sat at his desk, files and notes spread before him, when Ethan's name flashed across his phone. "You're going to want to hear this," Ethan said, skipping pleasantries. Lucas grabbed a pen. "Go." "I pulled case records for the past 3 years. Ethan's voice was steady, but there was something sharpened underneath, the kind of tone that meant he'd found something big. Black defendants in Judge Monroe's courtroom were fined an average of 3 times more than white defendants for the same infractions. Lucas's fingers tightened around his pen. 3 times? "Yeah, and get this, late arrivals?" Ethan paused. "White defendants were warned or allowed to proceed. Black defendants? Fined. Almost every time." Lucas exhaled slowly, his pulse steady but his frustration rising. "It's worse than I thought," Ethan continued. "He's denying payment plans disproportionately, too. White defendants who request time to pay, 74% approved. Black defendants, 12%. Lucas's grip on his pen tightened. "And that's just the stuff on paper," Ethan added. "Who knows how much hasn't been documented?" Lucas tapped his desk, thinking fast. The numbers were damning, but numbers alone weren't enough. "I need more," Lucas said. "Witnesses, testimonies, people who've been through this." Ethan hesitated. "There's a clerk, Margaret Collins, been working in Monroe's courtroom for over a decade. She's careful, but she might know something." Lucas nodded to himself. He didn't need her to talk on record. Not yet. He just needed confirmation. "I'll find her," Lucas said. He ended the call, grabbed his briefcase, and headed back to the courthouse. By the time Lucas found Margaret Collins, the sun was already beginning to set. She was organizing files behind the clerk's desk, her movements calm but methodical, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. Lucas approached, keeping his tone low and professional. "Ms. Collins, my name is Lucas Bennett." He flashed his Department of Justice credentials, watching her expression carefully. Her hands paused briefly over the files, not in fear, but in calculation. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was even, but Lucas caught the flicker of something else. awareness, maybe even expectation. Lucas leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I need to know what you've seen." For the first time, Margaret really looked at him. She exhaled softly. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "Come back after hours, Mr. Bennett. I'll show you what you're looking for." Lucas sat across from Margaret Collins in a quiet corner of a nearly empty cafe, a steaming cup of coffee between them. The courthouse had long since closed, but Margaret had kept her word. She had brought a small, worn notebook, its pages filled with years' worth of observation. "I started keeping track about 5 years ago," she said, flipping to a dog-eared page near the beginning. "It wasn't always like this, but at some point, it became impossible to ignore." Lucas scanned the handwritten notes, his pulse steady but burning with quiet anger. Case 4123. Black defendant, fined $500 for contempt, late by 3 minutes. Case 4128. White defendant, late by 9 minutes, no fine. Case 5372. Black defendant denied payment plan for minor infraction. Case 5381. White defendant granted payment plan for the same charge. Margaret sighed, shaking her head. The numbers tell the story. It's not just the fines. It's how he speaks to people, how he dismisses some cases without a second thought, but others he makes an example of. Lucas leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "And no one's said anything?" She gave him a pointed look. "People have tried. You think this is the first time someone's noticed? But Monroe, he's careful. And most of the people who go through his courtroom, they don't have the resources to fight back." Lucas tapped his fingers against the table, thinking fast. "What about other clerks, the bailiffs, anyone else who might be willing to talk?" Margaret hesitated, then sighed. "James Wilson. He's been a bailiff here for over 15 years. If anyone knows the way Monroe operates, it's him." Lucas filed the name away. He had what he needed for now. It was time to move. By the next morning, Lucas's team at the U.S. Attorney's Office had compiled a detailed report of Monroe's fine discrepancies and case outcomes. The numbers were damning. But numbers alone wouldn't break this open. Lucas needed attention. He sat at his desk, phone in hand, scrolling through his contacts. Then he found the name he was looking for. Monica Reyes, investigative journalist, Atlanta Tribune. She answered on the second ring. "Lucas Bennett. Didn't think I'd be hearing from you anytime soon." Her voice was sharp, quick. She wasn't one for small talk. "I have something for you, Monica," he said, keeping it brief. "Something or someone?" But there was a pause, then the sound of papers shifting on her end. "I'm listening." Lucas wasted no time. He outlined the disparity in Monroe's rulings, the inconsistencies in fines, the first-hand accounts from both clerks and bailiffs, and the sheer scope of the injustice happening in Monroe's courtroom every single day. By the time he was done, Monica was silent. Then she let out a slow breath. "You have proof?" Lucas smiled grimly. "I have more than proof. I have witnesses." Another pause, then a decision. "Send me everything you have. I'll make sure people see it." The article dropped 2 days later. The headline was impossible to ignore. "Pattern of bias? Investigation raises questions about Judge Monroe's courtroom practices." Lucas stood in his office, watching the news unfold in real time. The article laid everything bare. The numbers, the testimonies, the questions Monroe could no longer dodge. Within hours, social media erupted. The hashtags #EqualJusticeNow and Monroe Bias trended on Twitter. The Atlanta Tribune's comment section flooded with stories, people who had been through Monroe's courtroom and had experienced the same treatment Lucas had. By that afternoon, local news picked up the story. By evening, Monroe's name was on every major network in Georgia. Lucas's phone buzzed constantly. Calls from attorneys, community leaders, even former defendants who wanted to come forward. Then another name flashed across his screen. James Wilson. Lucas picked up. "You've stirred the pot, Mr. Bennett," Wilson said, his voice low but unreadable. Lucas didn't hesitate. "You ready to tell the truth?" A pause. "Then," Wilson exhaled. "Yeah, I am." Lucas knew it was coming. The moment Monica Reyes' article hit the public, the reaction was immediate and relentless. But even he hadn't anticipated just how fast the fire would spread. By the time he arrived at his office the next morning, the media frenzy had grown beyond control. Cable news anchors debated the implications of Monroe's courtroom bias. Social media had turned into a battleground, with thousands of people sharing personal stories of injustice they had experienced in municipal courts. Some in Monroe's courtroom specifically, others in similar courtrooms across the country. The headlines kept coming. Federal prosecutor challenges questionable court practices in Atlanta. Judge Monroe under fire for allegations of racial disparity in sentencing. Legal community demands investigation into systemic bias in Georgia's courtrooms. Lucas sat at his desk scrolling through countless messages and missed calls. His email was flooded, some from attorneys offering support, others from people sharing their own stories of mistreatment in the legal system. Then a name he'd been waiting for popped up. James Wilson. The longtime bailiff had agreed to meet in person, and Lucas wasn't about to waste a second. The whistleblower. James Wilson was a man of quiet authority, someone who had spent years watching everything in that courtroom without saying a word. Now he was ready to break the silence. They met in a dimly lit diner off Peachtree Street, away from the chaos of downtown. Wilson arrived in his court uniform, his expression unreadable. Lucas didn't press him, he just waited. Finally, Wilson leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "I've worked under Monroe for 15 years, he said, "and I've seen this kind of thing over and over, the way he talks to some people, the way he treats others like they don't belong in his courtroom. And the fines, always heavier for the same group of people." Lucas nodded, encouraging him to continue. Wilson hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "It's not just about fines, Bennett. It's about who gets to speak, who gets a second chance. I've watched men come in with records a mile long and walk out with nothing but a warning. But a kid from the wrong side of town, one mistake, and Monroe makes sure they never forget it." Lucas took a slow breath. This was the confirmation he needed. Wilson looked away, shaking his head. "I should have spoken up years ago, but nobody ever did. And when you work in a place like that long enough, you start thinking nothing's ever going to change." Lucas met his eyes. "But it can. It starts with people like you stepping up." Wilson gave a short, humorless chuckle. "You think one story's going to bring him down? Monroe's got friends in high places. He's been doing this a long time." Lucas tapped his fingers on the table. "Maybe one story isn't enough. But this is bigger than one story now." He slid a USB drive across the table. Inside are records my team pulled, case files, fine amounts, court transcripts. The data backs up everything you just said. And now we have you. Wilson stared at the USB drive, then at Lucas. A long pause, then he picked it up. "All right, Bennett, let's do this." The breaking point. That night, Wilson went on record. His testimony was aired on national television, his words clear and deliberate. "I have personally witnessed Judge Monroe issue fines disproportionately based on race and socioeconomic background. I've watched the same violations be punished differently depending on who stood before him. This is not speculation, this is fact." The moment his statement went public, the floodgates burst open. More court staff came forward, clerks, former bailiffs, even attorneys who had seen the same patterns for years but had felt powerless to stop it. The next morning, Lucas's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Monica Reyes. "Check the news. It's happening." Lucas turned on the TV. There on the screen was Judge Monroe, his face tight, his demeanor shaken, dodging questions from reporters as he exited the courthouse. Microphones and cameras surrounded him, reporters shouting over each other. "Judge Monroe, do you have a response to the allegations? Are you stepping down from the bench? Do you deny the claims of racial bias in your courtroom?" Monroe said nothing. He climbed into his black sedan, the door slamming shut behind him. The car sped away, leaving behind a storm of flashing cameras and shouted accusations. Lucas leaned back in his chair, watching the scene unfold. This wasn't just about one fine anymore. This wasn't just about one judge. This was about a system finally being forced to face its failures. And Lucas knew this was far from over. Judge Gerald Monroe had ruled over his courtroom for nearly 2 decades, wielding his gavel with an iron grip, unchallenged and unquestioned. Until now, the allegations against him had exploded into the national spotlight, and the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Lucas sat in his office, scrawling through the latest headline. Judge Monroe under formal investigation for judicial misconduct. DOJ examining pattern of bias in Monroe's courtroom. Bailiff speaks out, eyewitness discrimination firsthand. The weight of public scrutiny had grown unbearable. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice should be blind," and "End bias now." Attorneys who had once avoided speaking out now openly condemned Monroe's rulings, sharing stories of clients unfairly punished under his authority. The Judicial Review Commission had convened an emergency session ordering an audit of Monroe's case history. The numbers spoke for themselves. Black defendants had been fined at 3 times the rate of white defendants, payment plans were disproportionately denied, and contempt fines were issued with no clear standard other than Monroe's own discretion. Now he was on the defensive, scrambling to control the narrative. The desperate defense. Monroe broke his silence with a carefully scripted statement at a press conference. "I have always conducted my courtroom with fairness and integrity," he said, his voice even, but the strain was visible. Lucas watched from his office, arms crossed. "Any claim that I have acted with bias is an unfortunate misinterpretation of my dedication to upholding the law. I will fully cooperate with any investigation." It was exactly what Lucas expected, a half-hearted attempt at damage control. But it was too late. The final blow. The Judicial Review Commission's findings were released a week later, and they were devastating. Over 80 documented cases of excessive fines for minor infractions, all targeting black defendants. Multiple cases where Monroe had denied legal representation requests, forcing people to navigate the system alone. Direct testimony from clerks, attorneys, and former court staff, confirming long-standing discriminatory practices. The final report concluded with a single, damning sentence. Judge Gerald Monroe has violated the principles of judicial fairness and has failed to uphold the ethical standards required of his position. The pressure became unbearable. Facing formal censure, public outrage, and potential disbarment, Monroe resigned in disgrace. The aftermath. Lucas sat in the back row of the courtroom on the day Monroe's resignation was announced. The same room where he had been fined unjustly now felt different, lighter, freer. As Monroe's replacement was sworn in, a judge with a reputation for fairness and transparency, Lucas felt a rare moment of satisfaction. But he knew this wasn't just about one man. This was about an entire system that had let Monroe operate unchecked for years. The work wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Judge Gerald Monroe's resignation sent shockwaves through the legal community, but for many, his downfall was only the beginning. The pressure to hold him accountable didn't end with his departure from the bench. Ethics complaints piled up, and the Georgia State Bar launched its own disciplinary investigation, considering whether he should be permanently disbarred. For Lucas, this was never just about Monroe. It was about exposing a deeper issue in the system. And now that system was forced to respond. Judicial reforms take shape. The Judicial Review Commission's report didn't just outline Monroe's misconduct. It revealed widespread inconsistencies in how municipal courts handled fines, sentencing, and judicial discretion. Within weeks, reform proposals flooded the Georgia legislature. Mandatory bias training. All municipal judges were required to complete annual training on implicit bias and judicial fairness. Case audits and oversight committees were established to review sentencing patterns and find disparities. Appeal and complaint access. A new process was introduced, making it easier for defendants to challenge unfair fines without financial hardship. Payment plan reforms. Courts could no longer deny payment plans without justification, preventing predatory fines from trapping people in financial ruin. Lucas watched these changes with cautious optimism. The legislation was a step forward, but real reform didn't happen on paper. It happened in the courtroom, in the way judges wielded their power. And that fight was far from over. A ripple effect across the country. Monroe's case had started as a local scandal, but now it was a national conversation. Other courts fell under scrutiny, with investigative journalists uncovering similar disparities in judicial rulings across multiple states. The Department of Justice took notice, announcing a nationwide review of municipal court practices, particularly in fine-based sentencing disparities. Across the country, judges faced new levels of accountability. For the first time in years, the system was forced to look in the mirror. A personal victory. 3 months after Monroe's resignation, Lucas found himself standing in the same courthouse where it had all begun. The walls had been repainted and a new information desk stood at the entrance, offering resources for defendants who couldn't afford legal counsel. But the most noticeable change, the energy in the room was different. Lucas watched as a young black man approached the podium, requesting a payment plan for a minor infraction. The judge, Monroe's replacement, listened, reviewed the case, and approved the request without hesitation. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. Lucas knew there was more work to be done. But today, justice had won a battle, and that was enough to keep fighting. Lucas stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, arms crossed, watching as the legal system he had fought to reform began to shift, slowly but undeniably. The gavel still echoed against the wooden bench, but it no longer carried the weight of unchecked power. Instead, it was wielded by a judge who understood that justice wasn't about punishment, it was about fairness. Judge Monroe was gone, but his legacy wasn't erased overnight. The damage he had done, the lives impacted by his rulings, the financial burdens placed on those who couldn't fight back, would take years to repair. Lucas knew that. He also knew that change was happening, not just in this one courthouse, but across the country. The legacy of reform. The impact of Monroe's downfall had reached far beyond Atlanta. More judges were placed under review, their sentencing records scrutinized for patterns of discrimination and abuse of power. Statewide reforms gained momentum, with legislatures pushing for greater oversight and transparency in municipal courts. Law schools and civil rights organizations began training young attorneys to identify and challenge judicial bias in real time. Lucas had spent his career prosecuting criminals, but for the first time, he felt like he had helped rebuild something, not just tear something down. And that mattered. The next generation. One afternoon, Lucas was invited to speak at a local law school where students packed into an auditorium, eager to hear about the case that changed Georgia's judiciary. As he finished his remarks, a young black law student approached him, gripping a notebook filled with scribbled notes and highlighted passages. "Mr. Bennett, I just wanted to say, your fight reminded me why I wanted to be a lawyer. It showed me that the law isn't just about rules, it's about people." Lucas smiled, humbled by the words. He glanced down at the student's notebook, filled with ideas for reform, and nodded. "Then keep fighting for them, the work isn't done." A framed reminder. Back in his office, Lucas glanced at the framed document on his wall. The original $800 fine Monroe had issued him that morning in court. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder of the fight, of the system's flaws, and of why standing up mattered. One battle had been won, but the war for true justice was just beginning. The story of Lucas Bennett's fight against judicial bias carries a powerful lesson. Change doesn't happen unless someone is willing to challenge the status quo. For years, people sat in Judge Monroe's courtroom, seeing the injustice but feeling powerless to stop it. Many accepted their fate, believing that the system was too big, too entrenched to change. But Lucas refused to accept that. His story reminds us that one voice, armed with truth and persistence, can spark a movement. It shows that even when the fight seems impossible, even when authority feels untouchable, standing up matters, because courage inspires others to do the same. For those who have spent a lifetime witnessing unfairness in different forms, this message is especially important. No matter our age, we all have the ability to make a difference, whether by speaking up, supporting those who do, or simply refusing to look away. True justice isn't just about laws. It's about how we treat each other, how we hold people accountable, and how we leave the world a little fairer than we found it. It's never too late to take a stand. Lucas Bennett's journey proves that one person can make a difference when they refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Real change begins with courage, truth, and persistence. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to hear more powerful stories of justice, resilience, and the fight for fairness.